Hear these words from a book all the way toward the end of the Bible and the end of the New Testament, the book of James. How many of you have ever read from the book of James? It's not Jimmy, by the way, it's James, okay? Now, the book of James is kind of it's not a heretical thing, but the book of James, especially when it came out as a letter, okay, and when it started circulating, it created quite a stir in the early development of Christianity and the few churches that existed at that time. They had started arguing about a lot of things. It sounds like churches, doesn't it? But anyway, they had started arguing about Paul's theory that we are never saved by anything but faith alone, not by our own goodness, not because we earned it or because we're thought of better by God than other people. Just by faith alone are we saved, okay? Well, some people started arguing that, well, I believe all the right things, so I'm saved. Don't ask me to go out and care about these other people and everything. You get that argument. It's still going on today, by the way. But so James, whoever James was, wrote this letter that started going around to the churches and really hitting some people right between the eyes. So listen to these words from the second chapter of what we now call the book of James, beginning at the 14th chapter and going to the end of that chapter. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith." You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. Thus, the scripture was fulfilled that says, "Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. Here ends the reading of sacred texts. May God grant its meaning to our hearts and minds. Okay, we're going to a little pass down memory lane, especially for those of us my age. But many of you know Paul Simon, don't you? You know of Paul Simon, the musician? He wrote a song that we all have probably heard at one time or another that Leonard Bernstein, while he was still alive, called, in Leonard Bernstein's opinion, the greatest music that was ever written in the 20th century. Really? Leonard Bernstein said that. You know what the song was? Yeah. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk to you again." Remember that? "Because a vision softly keeping left its seats while I was sleeping." Okay, now, what did it say about it was people talking without speaking and people hearing without listening? And that's what the sounds of silence was all about, didn't he? Okay? Talking without speaking, hearing without listening. What's that mean? Talking without speaking. Well, it can mean even worse than that. Think about that. Talking, you're talking, making noise without speaking. Think of our political world. For instance, if you have a friend or family member that you know needs to get some help for something, and they come to you and you tell them what you know they want to hear but not what they need to hear, are you talking without speaking in the way the sounds of silence, see? Say something that fills up the air but doesn't mean anything. That's what Simon was talking about. How about the other one? Hearing without listening. That's Protestant worship in the last 2 centuries. It is. I mean, you know what? Ever since Zwingli and Calvin had their big argument about what was the most important part of worship, Calvin said it was the liturgy, and Zwingli said it was the sermon. And Zwingli won the argument. Really? Most of Protestant worship for a long, long time now has been some paid, mostly man, unfortunately, up in front, oh God, like me. You know, brrr. And the response to that has always been to what? Gripe about it being too long. Really, it's not quite, I don't think it's too unfair of me to say that's a form of hearing without listening. Maybe because there was nothing worth listening to. But you get the drift of what he was trying to say in Sounds of Silence. How many of you play the piano? Do you? How many of you that play the piano have ever tried to play the Sounds of Silence, the arrangement that was written for piano? It's one of the hardest things you'll ever see. It's really, really deep musically, too, the Sounds of Silence. But Paul Simon, way back then, I think that was in late 60s, early 70s. It had to be then because I still remember that. But anyway, he was trying to get the society to listen to those words and realize that there's a whole lot of nothing that meant anything that was being talked about, but nothing was changing. Nothing was changing. Okay? I want us to think about taking those two things, the talking and hearing, and putting them together. How about talking without listening? I want us to take that concept and think about that for a while. The day before he was killed, we learned this morning, murdered in Memphis, Tennessee, as he stood on the balcony of the motel he was staying in. Not a 5-star hotel, but a motel. Why had he gone there? Does anybody remember why Martin Luther King had gone there? He was trying to support persons who were garbage workers in that city. Now, they were not all black. They were not all white. Not all of them spoke English. Why was he supporting them? Because they were not only poor, but it was unfair that they were poor. They were working on behalf of everyone, doing something that everyone either wouldn't or couldn't do themselves, weren't they? And so he went there because, boy, is that something that's unfair. And he got killed for it. But the day before he was shot, he said, look it, all I want to do is do God's will. So he got killed for standing up and speaking out for persons who were being treated unjustly, unfairly, who were being made poor, but we allowed them to do things for us and didn't care. I mean, let's be fair about it. I'm speaking for myself. How many times have you ever cared about your garbage person? Did you know this person? Don't know him, okay. But you cared about him, why? Because if they didn't come, you'd have garbage. Did you care about them? Man, I hope they're getting paid well enough. Did you really? Good for you, because Martin Luther King maybe made you think of that. I told you in another sermon a few weeks ago that the only time I ever got arrested, I was demonstrating on behalf of the women, mostly a couple men, who worked in nursing homes, who took care of our parents because either we wouldn't or we couldn't do it ourselves. They bathed them, they fed them, they wiped them, and they couldn't even live on the amount of money they were paid. Almost every one of them had to have another job and even another full-time job on top of that. There was something really wrong with that. I mean, look at the service they're giving, and they're being made to remain poor. Something wrong with that. I don't think I would have done that if it hadn't been that Martin Luther King had done things like he did, and all those other persons in the 60s that followed him went to Selma, Alabama. Some of them died. Many of them were in jail for many, many days. They were hosed with high-power hoses. They were whipped, they were beaten, dogs bit them. But they did that because they were speaking out against something that was intolerable. Or, that should have been intolerable. Okay? Now, there's been a lot of efforts around cities. Let me give you an example here. How many of you know the real story about what has been called white flight from cities to the suburbs in the 1950s? Have you ever heard those terms? White flight? Okay, it refers to the fact that the suburbs were built, from cities, where all the way through and including World War II, most of the people in the United States lived in cities. How many of you knew that? Did you know that? Okay. If you didn't, you better be a farmer, because there weren't any suburbs, okay? So during World War II, blacks and whites and Hispanics and all sorts of people lived together in cities and got along okay, it was okay. But then after World War II, our government came up with what sounded like a great idea, okay? We want to make it possible for the majority of Americans to be homeowners. And so the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and part of the VA, the Veterans Administration, were put together, and they were given the power to underwrite loans, guarantee loans, that were given to people to buy homes by banks and credit unions and people like that, okay? Did you know that that's how the FHA and that part of the VA got started? Yeah, and that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? I mean, most Americans would become homeowners. That's a good idea, except that, you know what happens after a law gets passed by Congress? Then it's the job of bureaucrats to write all the regulations that make those laws become real. So the laws start working. Guess who wrote all the regulations for those loan programs? Yes, not only white people, white Southerners. I'm not kidding you. This is the true history of what happened. Now, how many of you have ever heard the term redlining? Have you ever heard it? Do you know what that, I hope, was? Okay, the regulations around those laws about the loans said that every loaning institution had to have somewhere in its offices, and it had to be visible on a wall, it had to have a map, and it had to have a circle around the area that it was willing to loan for housing, okay? That was a requirement. Again, that's not a bad idea. What's the use of going and asking for a loan if that bank or that credit union isn't giving money out for the place you want to live, okay? So that was a good idea, except there was another regulation that was written because they said you can only give out these loans that are underwritten by the government if they're for a homogeneous neighborhood. Did you know that? Homogeneous neighborhood. What's that mean? All the same color. That's what it meant. All the same color. Didn't have anything to do with income, didn't have anything to do with anything but color. Okay? Now, you couldn't build in cities because there wasn't any space in cities to build. So all these homes are going to be built in the suburbs. And if you weren't white, guess what? So the redlining showed where the homogeneous places were going to be and where black and Hispanic people, by law, couldn't get a loan. How many of you even knew that? It's pitiful, isn't it? You know when that stopped? 1977. The law was finally repealed. I shouldn't say the law, the regulations were finally rewritten by law, requiring them to be rewritten. 1977. That's horrible. By then, suburbs were almost completely white. If you were black or you spoke English with a real strong accent, you almost had no choice but to live in a city, which by now were so crowded. And all the places were owned by absentee landlords, okay? Boy, that stinks, doesn't it? Whoa, boy. Nothing much was done about it until, you know what happened? Some people in the suburbs started getting together with some realtors, some of the lawmakers, and some blacks and mostly Puerto Rican people from the cities, and they started doing this testing stuff so that their place would be for sale. First, the black persons, by the way, who absolutely qualified in every way for the house. They had a great job and all this other stuff. They could easily pay any mortgage that needed to be gotten for the house. They would go and be told, no, it's already been sold, or the apartment, no, it's already been rented. Then, of course, right after them, who goes in? The white tester, who immediately was told, yeah, we can give you a loan to buy that house, or yes, you can rent that apartment, immediately. So all of a sudden, the red flag goes up. The realtor is given only one choice. Either rent this or sell this to the person of color, or you can walk with us down to the courthouse because you're going to jail. That's the only way that ever changed. Only way. A woman wrote a book called The Education of a Wasp. You know what a wasp was in those days? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, okay? How many of you ever read that book? It's not in print anymore. She lived in one of those real nice suburbs of Chicago, northeast, okay, Winnetka or someplace like that. But she was an Episcopal church member, very active in her church, and she really considered herself the kind of person that can't just talk about things. She's got to go and do things. So she started leading protests in her all-white suburb saying fair housing, open housing, and they'd walk around with signs, and she got most of her neighbors to go around with her, protesting, we need open housing, everything like this, until, you know what happened? Yeah, the council of the town in which she lived and all her neighbors lived, where they were going around with the signs. Of course, they were doing in Chicago down there. The council of their town said, well, you know, this law applies to us too. We got to have open housing here. All of a sudden, all those people that were willing to walk around in Chicago saying open housing, fair housing, they came to the council meetings and said, no, not in my backyard. They started fighting it. That was her book, The Education of a Wasp. It's easy to talk a good line. It's easy to demonstrate as long as it's not going to bring any change into your life, was her point. But all those people that I thought I had led on these things that were going to change our society for everybody, as soon as it came to their backyard, they fought it. All I wanted to do was serve God, said Martin Luther King Jr. You know? The one thing that we did have, the prayer, I believe, that you offered, after his talking about poverty, there's only one way to deal with it in a land this rich. He said, get rid of it. Four words, get rid of it. Well, the prayer afterwards said, so that, oh God, we wish that everybody was able to live in equal measure. I think it would be more radical that we would pray and start working that everybody could live with sufficient measure. Really. I don't care if there's a bunch of billionaires. I don't care. They can do whatever they want. But I want to make sure that somebody that's going to work every day of their life and helping those billionaires become billionaires, I want to make sure somebody who's out there taking care of our parents in a nursing home, I want to make sure that somebody who's picking up the garbage at my house every week, I want to make sure that they have a living wage. So it means they can own their own home with their family, if that's what they want to do. They can have a meaningful 2 to 4 weeks of vacation every year, so they could actually, relax or something like that. They could buy their kids their own presents every time they wanted to have them instead of having to go to the fireman. That's what I'd like to see. That's a sufficient measure. That doesn't say that we're trying to claim everybody should have the same amount of money, everybody should have the same amount of wealth, everybody live in the same mansion or something. Why ask for that? It'll never happen. But you know what? You want to be radical. Now we start arguing, why in a nation as wealthy, as rich, as blessed as this nation is and shall continue to be, why can't everyone who's willing to work have a living wage? Why can't everyone have a sufficient measure to live a decent life? You know what's going to happen if we start making noise about that? You know what's going to happen? I'm not being dramatic about this. We'll start getting death threats on our telephones. We will. We'll start getting things thrown at us if we go out and start, going to the State House and saying that this is what we want. It goes a lot further than minimum wage, but it has to start there, for instance. We really will, because you see, we can't be told that's not possible. It is. It would change things drastically in our society. It would. And people don't want that. So you see, if we listen to people that are in need, we don't get things that don't work, like those white people who left their white suburb and went to Chicago to talk about fair housing, but when it came to their suburb, they were against it. If we would have listened to the people who were already in crowded, lousy tenement housing in the city, even though they were working 1 and 2 jobs all week long, they would have told us, no, I don't want to live in Winnetka, but I would like to have the chance to go out and live in a decent house someplace and raise my kids in a good school system. So just enable me to do that, they would have told us. A long, long time ago, we would have not made the mistake that was made in New Haven, Connecticut. They had the first low-income housing built in the United States. Did you know that? New Haven, Connecticut did. And that's the place where everybody now goes to find out what not to do, because they built high-rise housing. What are those called now? Projects, yeah. That's what they built because they're cheaper. You don't have so much land here to build straight up. The worst thing in the world for families with children. The worst thing in the world. You know what they're the best thing in the world for? Senior citizen housing. Did you know that? Security is much easier in a building that has elevators. Senior citizen housing for people that no longer have kids around and stuff, if they need to have good apartments, nice places, the best way to do that in a city is build them straight up. Best way to do low-income housing is have it spread out all over the place in the suburbs, okay? But then if we listen to the people that got some of the homes, the low-income homes from, like Habitat for Humanity, Inner City Christian Federation and that, you know what else we learned? It's wonderful having our house, but now we don't have enough money to keep a car. The car, because insurance costs so much and everything like that. If we had bus service, we could get to our job. But we don't have that out here in the suburbs, huh? Okay, if we being the people who pass the laws and spend the money and raise the taxes or not, if we had listened before we talked, if we had listened before we act, we might have known what the right thing was to do. If instead we just talk because it makes us feel good, because we're saying what we think is the right thing, which merely means it's what all our friends want to hear us say, if that's all we're doing, we might do more harm than good if we talk without listening. So that writer, that heretical writer in the book of James, he said, look it, faith, he means belief, what we say we believe, without action is dead. You show me your faith, I'll show you he called it, the word was works, action, what I do with my life. I'll show you that, and I'll show you that I did it because of my faith. But you don't show me any actions at all and say you have faith, you have dead faith. An even worse thing, my people, is if we believe that we can go out and do the right thing for persons that are very different than we are. If we think we can do that, it doesn't matter if they're white or black or Hispanic or anything, and we don't know them. If we haven't listened to them, the old Native American slogan, until we've walked a mile in their moccasins, we don't know what we're talking about. Boy, is it time. I hope it's not too late. For the Christians that remain in this world and in this country to start taking it seriously, that we've got to act. We've got to make real what we say we believe. Yeah, our mission statement enables us to do it in 2 very real ways right in Lowell. But the people who, the parents of the kids that are coming for the tutoring, too many of them believe they have no way out of their poverty. Too many of them are right. Because as much as we might say, hey, go get yourself a better education, why don't you go do this or that, they know that the only place they can go to work is the place that they are already working. Okay? So we got to keep listening. We got to get to know people. Before we talk, before we say what ought to be, let's be willing to make what ought to be happen. We're going to have to pay for that. But if we don't, I fear there's nobody else left. And I think that's what Martin Luther King Jr. already knew. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.